Good evening. This is Reader Ryan Paul Winter, and tonight I want to do the first in a three-part series on the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus, or Climacus is just the Greek word for ladder. So he's named Saint John of the Ladder. In the West, he's also called St. John Scholasticus, St. John the Scholastic. In the East, we prefer the name St. John of the Ladder. His work has a very prominent place in the spiritual life of the Orthodox Church. He has an entire Sunday of Great Lent dedicated to him, and for that reason, he's exercised a great deal of influence on the ascetic piety, not just of monastics, which is as we'll see, that's the audience he was mainly addressing. That's the audience he was addressing, but it has also influenced the ascetical and spiritual life of lay people as well, and rightly so. It's a really profound book, and the amazing thing I think about how profound it is the rather simple way he expresses himself. It's not simplistic at all, but he has a non-complicated way of speaking. He uses images and examples from modern life, from everyday life that are very easy to comprehend and understand, and yet at the same time, he's not oversimplifying the matter at all. The spiritual life is very complicated and has lots of pitfalls and things that are difficult to understand, and he makes full appreciation of that at the same time, being very clear because he's very simple. He's not simplistic, though. So let's start actually with the icon of the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is a rather famous icon from St. Catherine's Monastery. St. John Climacus spent much of his monastic life at the Transfiguration Monastery, is what it was known as at that time. It is also now known as the St. Catherine's Monastery. You've probably seen this mosaic of the Transfiguration, really one of the oldest icons that we have, because it is a mosaic. And it's in the apse of the church there at St. Catherine's Monastery, because, as I say, originally it was dedicated to the Transfiguration. Likewise, St. Catherine's has a number of valuable icons. Maybe some of you were here when Father Justin of Mount Sinai was here as the librarian. He's the librarian. And was able to tell us some things about the monastic life there at the present time. So, as I say, this is an icon of the Ladder of Divine Ascent, and if you were to get up close to it, you would see that it has 30 rungs on the ladder, which correspond to the 30 steps of the work, the ladder. St. John structured his work in terms of 30 steps, and this is said to be equal to the number of years of the earthly life of our Lord, 30. And you can see on this icon here, Christ himself is at the top, that the goal of the ladder. St. John Climacus is leading everyone, including leading the bishop, interestingly enough. And you don't think so?
Bishops are not the holiness.
I see. I like to presume. Father Justin jokes that bishops are not always holy. I like to presume, give them the benefit of the doubt. Neither are priests, though. Neither are monks, and that's actually one of the points that this icon is making. If you see, there are 6 separate monks out of the 30-some or so on here. And 6 of them are in the midst of being dragged down into the pit of darkness. And they're dark figures here who are shooting arrows and using ropes to pull down these monastics. So even the monastic life again, this is the life that St. John was addressing. Even the monastic life is not a surefire way to be saved. There's no surefire way to be saved. That's part of the point of the spiritual life, that you have to put effort into it. So there are many pitfalls, and there are vices which can attack the monk as he progresses up the ladder of divine ascent. The ladder is termed a heaven-scaling ladder, while the vices which one can fall into are described in a parallel metaphor, namely that of a chain. The vices are links in a chain, and they are the chain which drags you down. You can see some of these dark figures here. They're holding ropes, or you might kind of envision them as chains. And they're using the vices, link by link, each vice connected to each other. One vice leading to another. You fall into one vice, and then you fall into another vice, and then you fall into another vice. That maybe by the end of it, you're falling into a vice that you never would have at the beginning. But that's the way the vices are. They lead you link by link into deeper and deeper evil. Likewise, the virtues, which many of the steps on the ladder are devoted to the virtues. Likewise, they too lead us up. You can't. One of the places in the ladder, St. John says, and it's an oft-repeated saying, that you cannot go up the whole ladder in one step. That's a very important principle of the spiritual life. You can't skip and put your foot first thing on the 30th step. It just doesn't work that way. You have to progress up step by step, and sometimes you have to repeat steps. Sometimes you have to emphasize steps again. And as I say, it's not like once you're done with step one, then you stand on step two, and now I don't have to think about step one anymore. As a matter of fact, if you read the book, it's very clear. You have to continue to think about every single previous step as you continue up. Any comments or questions before we go on about this icon in particular? Question: can those who have fallen from the ladder return back up? Well, it certainly appears that that this icon shows them. Actually, there's 7 people falling, aren't there? One of them's already halfway into the black pit. This icon, I think, for educational purposes, shows them as not being able to come back up. But if you read many passages within St. John, he talks, for example, he says, those who have fallen into a pit, the only way that they can come back out is by going to the lowest state of humility. So in actual fact, within the work, he gives ways to recover from spiritual falls. It's very interesting. There's even one point where he says, a spiritual fall can be to your advantage if you know how to use it properly. Namely, what I just mentioned, humility. If you can take a spiritual fall and you can make it into occasion for humility, it works to your advantage. Not that the fall was good, not that the sin was good, but you can use it to your advantage. Question: is there any significance to the demon to the left above the ladder? There is a special demon up there towards the top. I would assume that each one of these demons down here seems to be targeting a specific monk. So this is probably one that's roving for the others and looking for a likely target, I would say, is the intent of that. So we always have to be on guard. St. John in the ladder warns us of that repeatedly, that he says that the demons are wily foes who carry fire in their hands, and we must constantly be vigilant and ever watchful for them. I think, actually, that's one of the ways that St. John of the Ladder can address and help us in our spiritual life. You almost seem to think that he's demon-phobic, how often he talks about demons. But it's interesting to me how we, in our modern kind of, we seem to have outgrown demons, right? They're not cool to talk about. And in actual fact, I think that we have to view evil as personal. Evil is not this impersonal force that kind of pushes us. Evil is temptation by another person. And that's why the fathers were so clear to identify temptations with particular demons. Not because they were demon-phobic, but rather because they understood that evil was personal. There are a few things we need to be aware of in order to understand St. John's work. One of them that I want to talk about is the way that the monastic life is organized. And there are 3 different ways that the monastic life is usually organized. Does anybody know any of those 3? The communal, also known as synobitic, that's correct. The skeet life. There's one more. And the hermit. Okay, let me read a passage from St. John. The whole monastic life consists, this is step 1, paragraph 26. The whole monastic state consists of 3 specific kinds of establishment. Either the retirement and solitude of a spiritual athlete, or living in stillness with 1 or 2 others, or settling patiently in a community. Turn not to the right hand nor to the left, but follow the King's highway. Of the 3 ways of life mentioned above, the second is suitable for many people, for it is said, "Woe to him who is alone when he falls into despondency or lethargy or laziness or despair, and has no one among men to lift him up. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them, said the Lord." So the ideal type of monastic life, if I can put it that way, is the solitary. The original monastics, such as St. Anthony, were solitaries. They went off in the middle of the desert and they shut themselves in a cave and saw no one for decades. While this is a laudable form of life, it's also a very dangerous form of life. Because if you haven't mastered the passions to a large extent, you are very likely to fall into despondency. You're very likely to fall into delusion. You might even have demons come to you who disguise themselves as angels of light, and you think you're in communication with the angels and that you're the spiritual giant, when in actual fact you're being fed lies by the demons. It's really a great danger for being a solitary. So, a second form of life was introduced, namely the communal or the synobitic form of life, and that is understood. If you do want to move on to the solitary life, at this point it's understood that you're going to engage in the communal or synobitic life first. That is to gain experience with the monastic life, to gain experience with the way the spiritual life works, so that you will not fall into that delusion and despondency. You have the tools now to deal with that. Sort of a middle way, and the reason why this skeet type of arrangement works, a middle way to kind of have some of the benefits of both, is the skeet type arrangement, where you live with 2 or 3 other, 1 or 2 other persons, and so it has the advantages of the solitary life in the sense of isolation from people. You stay in your cell, you focus on yourself and your own passions, but at the same time you're not completely alone. You have someone there to be in obedience to these 1 or 2 other like-minded people. But that's the whole point. They have to be like-minded people, otherwise they're just going to be a distraction to you. Okay, any questions about the 3 states of monasticism? Okay.
It'd be fair to say, Ryan, that the largest number of monks in the world are in communities.
Yes, definitely. Synobitic monasticism is definitely the largest amount, and it's definitely anyone who's considering the monastic life at this point. You just simply have to start with the synobitic. Even the skeet life for beginners at this point is too much for us.
On Mount Athos, for instance, you enter a monastery, and they outside, and what happens is you're formed in the monastery, and then if the time is right, they might let you go out to the ski. After 10, 15 years, Saint Saran was like one of these.
Yes.
He was formed in the monastery, and then he went out to the ski. He lived by himself actually as a solitary for a while too. Only after about 10 or 15 years in the monastery.
And so one of the reasons why that's so important is you have to ask yourself the question, the ladder of divine ascent, who was it written for? And as you read the ladder of divine ascent, it's clear that it was written for cenobitic communal monks, beginners you might say, novices, as they are entering the monastic spiritual life. So that's significant to us in a number of ways. One, it's not for solitaries. So you're not going to find a lot of high theology, you might say, about the heights of grandeur of seeing the vision of God. You're going to hear a lot about do your work, cultivate the virtues, and we'll talk about this more as we go along. Also, on the other hand, especially for us, none of us in this room at this point are monastics, and so at the same time it's addressing the cenobitic life, and therefore there are likely to be some things that maybe don't apply to us or don't apply to us directly. So we'll see that as we go along. I want to say a little bit about the life of St. John. Nothing is known of the early life of St. John. When he was 16 years old, he became a novice under a spiritual father, Father Martyrius. Early on in his monastic life, he made a visit to a St. John Sabaite, who was head of a monastery near Alexandria. St. John made this visit together with his spiritual father, Father Martyrius. And John the Sabaite did a very peculiar thing. John the Sabaite, who, as I say, himself was a spiritual father, washed the feet of John while he did not wash the feet of Father Martyrius, which was really a strange and backwards thing to do since Martyrius was the elder of the two. Later on, it was asked John the Sabaite, why did you do this? And John replied, I don't know who that boy was, but I was washing the feet of the abbot of Mount Sinai, which indeed, later on, that's indeed what John Climacus became. Around this same time, John Climacus, together with his spiritual father Martyrius, also visited Anastasius, an elder, who made a prophecy in a similar vein about the spiritual greatness of John Climacus. There's some question about how long he was under the tutelage of Martyrius. There's a reference to the fact that when he was 19 years old, he sent Martyrius on before him. But the question is that 19 years old period, or is that when he was 19 years into the monastic life? To think that he was 19 years old, and just simply 19 years old, and then at that point, because he sent Martyrius on ahead of him, Martyrius reposed, then he entered the solitary life, that actually doesn't match with just what we were saying. So I think probably the life of St. John that's given in this version of the ladder is right, where it has a notation that after he had been a monk for 19 years, under obedience to Martyrius, living a more or less cenobitic lifestyle, at that point, then he retired to the solitary life. He retired to a place named Thola, which is a cave very near the monastery of St. Catherine. You can still go to it today. You go there and they'll show it to you. And in this solitary life, he remained for 40 years. And as often happens in the solitary life, a younger monk wants to become the disciple of the solitary, and so even solitaries end up not being fully solitaries because they admit a disciple into their cave, and the disciple then learns from them and learns the solitary life. Again, that's another way to kind of be in the middle state while you're still learning. You can't voyage off into the solitary life by yourself, so you become the disciple of a solitary and learn from his experience or her experience. So he took on a disciple named Moses, and there was one point in which St. John sent Moses on an errand. And during the errand, it was the middle of the day, and Moses got very tired, and he lay down in the shade underneath a big rock. And can you see where the story's going? He lay down under a big rock and fell asleep. And St. John was in his cell in a sort of light sleep, and someone came to him and said, "Why are you sleeping? Your disciple is in danger." And so St. John started praying in his cell, and the story goes that at that same moment, the disciple Moses heard his master calling to him, "Moses, Moses!" And he woke from sleep. He startled out of sleep, jumped out from underneath the rock as the rock crashed down. That, and there are other stories that I could tell about the miraculous, wonder-working St. John and his powers of vision and insight. When St. John continued to be advanced in the spiritual life, he began to admit more and more visitors, to the point that some people became jealous of him, and he was accused of being too talkative. They said, "Well, you're a solitary. You're supposed to be in silence. But you're admitting all these people. Look how talkative you are." That was the sort of jealous thing they said about him. So he said, "All right, okay, you think I'm too talkative?" Then he shut his mouth and didn't say a single word for another year. Completely. Not a single word. And at which point everyone said, maybe that wasn't a good way to go. And so they came to him and asked for forgiveness and said, "Please give us your words again. We want to hear your God-saving words." And so he broke his silence. Finally, towards the end of his life, probably his 80th year, he was asked to be the abbot at Mount Sinai Monastery. And he didn't want to do this, but he did it anyway. This is frequently what happens to solitaries. They get asked to be bishops or abbots or something, and they don't want to do it because they like being in their cell and seeing the vision of God, and instead they're called out to go be an abbot, which doesn't look like a very good alternative to them. But oftentimes, I don't know if this happened in the case of St. John, but oftentimes the Lord comes to them and says, "You need to share your insight with others, so I want you to be obedient and go be an abbot." So St. John, very likely out of a sense of obedience that he knew he needed to share his spiritual gifts with other people, went and became abbot. This was only a couple years, maybe a year or so before his death. And so he was only abbot of the monastery at Mount Sinai for just a few years. One other story to tell: on the day that he was made an abbot, there was a meal in the monastery, and there was a young youth, a younger man who was serving at tables, and nobody quite knew who he was. And later on, after a bit later, they asked St. John, "Who was that youth that nobody recognized?" And St. John basically said, "Oh, that was the prophet Moses. He comes every once in a while and serves tables." And that's actually apparently a fairly common story about that monastery because, as I say, that was Mount Sinai, right? That's the mountain of Moses, where Moses received the tablets of the law. So apparently Moses comes and does servant's work every once in a while. Okay, any questions or comments about the life of St. John? He wrote the book. I should have mentioned that. You're right. He wrote the book towards the end of his life, towards when he was a solitary. Apparently he wrote a great number of works. This is the main one that's remembered and passed down and copied. He wrote it at the request of one John of Riathu. So let me show you where a few things here are on the map, actually. So Mount Sinai is here in the Sinai wilderness. Riathu is down here on the Red Sea, the coast of the Red Sea, further north. And as I say, there was a John, an abbot of a monastery there at Riathu, who requested that St. John write of his spiritual insight, and so the ladder of divine ascent was the product of that. Also, there was one point, it very likely seems to be right before St. John wrote the ladder, because he in the ladder he makes many mentions of a John the Sabaite and his monastery, which was on the outskirts of Alexandria. A large Cenobitic monastery there on the outskirts of Alexandria. And also, which we will come to talk to by and by, there was kind of a side monastery next to that that was connected to the main monastery called the Prison. And that's where monks that were in need of repentance for some serious spiritual fall were sent there. And we'll come to that by and by. The next thing I want to talk about is a common a distinction in the monastic world and in the spiritual life. And that is the distinction between action and vision. Step 4, which is on obedience, paragraph 1. Let me read this. Our treatise now appropriately touches upon warriors and athletes of Christ. As the flower precedes the fruit, so exile either of body or will always precedes obedience. For with the help of these two virtues, the holy soul steadily ascends to heaven as upon golden wings. And perhaps it was about this that he who had the Holy Spirit sang, "Who will give me wings like a dove? And I will fly away and be at rest," is the rest of the verse. "Who will give me wings like a dove, and I will fly and be at rest." That was from the Psalms. And then St. John gives his interpretation of that. "I will fly by activity, and I will be at rest by divine vision and humility." So this terminology that John is using, called action, in Greek it's praktike, action. The Greek is praktike, and then there is the other word, vision, which is the Greek for that is theoria, as in theory. But don't be deceived, as I need to explain, it really isn't theory at all. In some ways, it's the opposite of what we mean by theory. A theory in terms of what is seen. Okay, so vision is referring to the vision of God, which God is unseen, and therefore it is a vision of that which is not seen. It's a vision of the unseen. That sort of paradox is common in the spiritual life, and oftentimes when divine vision is described, it's said, if you haven't experienced this, I'm sorry, I can't really tell you what it is. You just have to experience it yourself. But the best way they can experience it, or they can describe it, is that it's theoria. It's a vision of that which is unseen, a vision of God. So the point is that before that, and this is the point that John is making here in step 4, verse 1, "I will fly by activity, and I will be at rest by divine vision and humility." So the bird has to fly first, and once it flies for a while, then it can get to the place of rest. But it's not going to get there if it doesn't fly. So you see the point? Action, praktiki, practice, doing things. Asceticism. There's various different words that are used for this. Asceticism, virtues, cultivation of the virtues, doing the commandments, doing the gospel commandments. These are all different ways of talking about this stage of the spiritual life that, honestly, all of us here in this room, I'm going to be so bold as to say that all of us here in this room are beginners in the spiritual life. Maybe I'm wrong about one or two of us. But given our culture, given the brokenness of our culture, and given what I know about many of you and the background that I know of many of you, I'm not trying to be insulting. Please don't hear it like that. I'm just saying we have to be honest, and this is what I'm going to try to talk about through the rest of the talk. We've got to be honest about our spiritual life, and the honest truth is that we are novices and beginners, and therefore what we need to focus on is action, practice of the virtues, following the commandments. I mean, maybe one of us in this room has seen the divine light.
I consider this as a priest.
Yes.
In this parish. I meet people. Mm-hmm. I get to hear their confessions.
Yes.
And they're people that really might surprise you as to how advanced they are. But I would say you can't always tell who they are.
Father Justin,
it's really awesome.
Father Justin makes the point that there are people, and maybe I'm overstating the point here, that there are people who are perhaps a bit more advanced in the spiritual life, but the whole point about that is that they are hidden. They very likely could not be that advanced if they did not keep it hidden. Because if they didn't keep it hidden, then they really wouldn't have a very good way to cultivate humility.
I have heard a number of priest confessions. I've heard a lot of laity. I mean, in terms of just spiritual advancement, there are so many laity that blow us away.
Father Justin's comment is that the laity sometimes exceed the priest in terms of spiritual growth, and I think that's part of the cross of the priesthood. Actually, a priest have to be concerned with so many others' spiritual life. Sometimes maybe there's not so much time for your own spiritual life. Right, and furthermore, given our culture, we as a culture are at the bottom rung, if I can say it that way. Our culture does not prepare us to receive the gospel. Our culture does not prepare us to receive the truth of Orthodox Christianity. Our culture prepares us to come to Orthodox Christianity. We think we understand it. We try to do what we think we've understood, and we end up spinning our wheels and not getting anywhere. That's what our culture prepares us to do.
You want it my way right away.
Want it my way right away. And St. John, in many places in the ladder, tells us, this is the point I was making earlier about the 30 rungs, 30 steps. I think that's why he made such a large number of steps. He's trying to communicate to us that you can't just snap your fingers and be there. There's one place in the ladder where St. John says to praise the works of the saints is laudable. To try to emulate them is good, but to think that you're going to have their state just very quickly, it's totally wrong. It's totally delusional, is what he says. We just have to move step by step. And step by step, the first step is action, cultivating the virtues and obeying the commandments. And then in due time, that's the problem. We go looking for vision. We say, God, please send me a vision of yourself. Right? Well, that usually is pride. And therefore, that is very unlikely to be answered. In most cases, most instances of people being given the vision of God, it comes to them completely out of the blue. It's completely surprise. And it's people who have not focused on seeing the vision of God, but rather they've focused on action. And they've cultivated a life of action over many years. So maybe you've heard the saying that a theologian is one who prays. In the Orthodox Church, a theologian is not one who thinks great thoughts about God and understands God better than the rest of us. In the Orthodox Church, a theologian, one who has the theory, the theora, is one who prays, one who has the divine vision. Likewise, the ascetic is one who acts, who cultivates the virtues. Let me say that again. And you have to take this in order. Okay? First, the ascetic is one who acts, who cultivates the virtues. Second, the theologian is one who prays, who has the divine vision. Any questions about that? Comments? I admit I'm laying it on thick, but I think if we are going to understand this book rightly, the reason why I'm kind of laying it on thick here, if we're going to understand this book rightly, we've got to come to it with humility and contrition. We've got to say, I'm a beginner. I'm probably not even going to understand what I'm reading here. And I'm certainly not going to be able to apply everything exactly the way he says it. If any of you have ever read this book, I should have asked earlier for a show of hands. Who has read parts or all of this book? Okay? So those who have read the book, is it a harsh book? Is it a book that really challenges you? Okay, funny thing is that there are some writers that list the latter as a beginner's book. Okay?
Which it kind of is.
Which it kind of is. It is in the sense that it focuses mainly on action. That's why it's listed as a beginner's book, because it focuses mainly on action. But if you look at the action, even if you look at the action that it's calling you to, is it a harsh book? Is it, if I can use that word, by harsh I mean, is it difficult? Or do you say to yourself, can I do this? Right? It is. So in that sense, we are a beginner among the beginners. Okay, does that make sense?
And I think that last beautiful paragraph on love
Yes.
is what it's all about.
Yeah.
Surrender.
So,
To God, and these can help us, but in the final analysis, we just got to live.
the point that's being raised, and I completely believe it, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying here as that. The point is not keeping the commandments and action for the sake of action, right? The point is a relationship with God, and you could say that the vision part is the relationship with God. Exactly. That's the point. We're not keeping the virtues to keep the virtues.
If I can say, I think it's...
But you're right.
So, the organization of the ladder is in a set of concentric circles. The organization of the ladder is in a set of concentric circles, and in some ways, in the later sections, he comes back and treats the topics of the earlier section, that in the corresponding earlier section, in a new way, and talks about it in a higher way, you might say, a more exalted way, a way that maybe is a little bit more in the direction of vision as opposed to action. There's a lot of focus towards the beginning of the book on action, and right at the end, he has some things to say about the divine vision. So, specifically, chapters 1 through 3 are about this, what could be called a trinity. What could be called a trinity of beginning virtues, you might say. So it's exile, detachment, renunciation comes first. Renunciation, detachment, and exile. And then that corresponds towards a trinity of virtues that comes in the very last chapter, namely number 30, which is faith, hope, and love. And in step 26a, so there's kind of this addendum to 26. 26a, paragraphs 1, 2, and 3. He says, firm faith is the mother of renunciation. Unwavering hope is the door to detachment. The opposite of this is self-evident. Love of God is the foundation of exile. So he's renunciation, detachment, exile, which on the surface don't sound like a parallel to faith, hope, and love, in actual fact are, because I think contained within renunciation, detachment, and exile are the beginnings of faith, hope, and love, is the point that he's making.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yes.
Is that what he means by exile?
For a monastic, by exile, what he means is leaving your home and going to a new home that is your monastery.
Right. But when you think about love, you think about love as being directed toward other people.
Well, the point is that for a monastic, that's the way you direct your love towards God. You leave your homeland, which, think about in this day and time, leaving your homeland was a big deal. Leaving your family, leaving your homeland, all that behind, and you do this out of love for God.
One of the phrases in the exile chapter is,
Only when we love God.
Well, I think to try to give an initial answer to this question, let me say it this way: depending upon whether you're a monastic, and depending upon whether or not you're a solitary monastic, or a cenobitic monastic, or whether or not you're a priest, or whether or not you're just a lay person in the world, you're a married person, you're a single person, all those different ways of life, the love of neighbor looks different. The internal love of God is to be the same sort of exile from, maybe it's exile from family and homeland, or maybe it's just simply exile from evil. Maybe it's simply exile from worldly ways. But there has to be some sort of break with the evil of this world, the ways of this world, and that break is founded on the love of God. So I'm going to come more to this question by and by. Let me.
break cannot encompass judgment of the other people that you're breaking.
Yeah, he's very clear about that. It's not judgment and it's not hatred.
Well, and I've always heard that monastic's job is to pray for the world.
Monastic job.
That's how they love
Right. You pray for the world, and you pray for those in the world, and a monk is specifically to pray for his family. So, coming then to the next layer of the circle of the concentric rings, steps 4 through 7 have a parallel in steps 24 through 26, and in particular, the two longest chapters in the book. By far the longest chapters in the book is the chapter on obedience and the chapter on discernment. And I would submit to you that those two are parallel to each other. Maybe that doesn't make sense on the surface, but in the chapter in obedience, John has this short phrase when he's defining obedience that he says, obedience is an abandonment of discernment in a wealth of discernment. Let me repeat that again. Obedience is an abandonment of discernment in a wealth of discernment. So one of the points of obedience is that you say, I don't know everything. I don't understand everything. And because I don't clearly understand everything, what I need to do instead is take the counsel, take the commands, take the obedience of someone else. Maybe it's the obedience of a spiritual father. Maybe it's the obedience of the commands of the church. Again, it has to do with your mode of life. And again, I'll talk about that more in a minute. But the point is obedience is shifted to someone else and realizing I don't have discernment. I don't have wisdom. I don't know what I'm talking about. And so I'm going to abandon all that. And the irony of it is that when you abandon all that, that is precisely the beginning of having it. Obedience is an abandonment of discernment in a wealth of discernment. You begin to have the wealth of discernment precisely when you abandon it. Later on, when he defines discernment at the beginning of step 26, here's what he says. And perhaps this will make a little bit more clear what I'm trying to say. Step 26, paragraph 1. Discernment in beginners is a true knowledge of themselves. You hear that? Discernment in beginners is a true knowledge of themselves. So you don't have this exalted wisdom about other people. The first thing you got to do is learn how to see yourself for who you really are. Not be delusional about who you are. Not think, oh, I'm this advanced spiritual giant. when in actual fact you're a beginner. And that's the most important thing to discern about yourself, precisely that you are a beginner. As a beginner, you are a sinner. And as a sinner, you are in need of the beginning steps, namely action, praktiki. That you're not ready to go on to divine vision yet. So there's a sense of humility that's involved in that. Discernment in beginners is a true knowledge of themselves. In intermediate souls, it is a spiritual sense that faultlessly distinguishes what is truly good from what is of nature and opposed to it. In the perfect, it is a knowledge which they have within by divine illumination and which can enlighten with its lamp what is dark in others. So notice how you move from, first of all, you focus on yourself as a beginner. Then you kind of can understand some things out here, what is good, as opposed to what is of nature and opposed to nature. And then finally, when you reach a state of what he calls perfection, then you can actually understand, discern, have wisdom with others, and throw the divine illumination on them and their lives as well.
Obedience, what was the obedience to your spiritual father? I mean, obviously, isn't that what he meant? Obedience to your...
Obedience, the specific kind of obedience that he's talking about in this book, again, as I say, this is a book that's addressed to Cenobitic monastics. So the specific kind of obedience that he's talking about is obedience to his spiritual father. Again, one of the things I'm going to come to here in a little while is how we're going to apply this to ourselves and what obedience means for us. So then, beginning at step 8, then all the way up to step 26, he begins to look in earnest at the active life. So there's sort of an introductory section in 1 through 3, 4 through 7, and then really 4 through 7 is a part of the active life as well, I should say. 4 through 7 all the way up to 26, this is a focus on the active life. So notice his longest chapters are concerning the active life, obedience and discernment, and look how many steps he gives to the active life. And this is because this is directed at Cenobitic monks. This is directed at beginners. Again, this book is called for beginners. Perhaps next week when I talk about the passions, I'll talk more about these steps 8 through 23 and the details of the way he's organizing it there. Let me step on and skip on to something else. Because I want to come to the topic of how to read spiritual books. Okay, I just mentioned and I just read in step 26, verse 1, there was this distinction between those who begin, those who are in the middle way, and those who are the perfect. And this is a very common distinction that John makes throughout the entire ladder. Let me read another place where he makes it. Step 1, paragraph 16. In the very beginning of our renunciation, it is certainly with labor and grief that we practice the virtues, the active life. It is with labor and grief that we practice the virtues. When we make progress in them, we no longer feel sorrow or we feel a little sorrow. But as soon as our mortal mind is consumed and mastered by our zeal, we practice them with all joy and eagerness, with love and the divine fire. Divine fire actually would be another kind of reference to the divine vision. When the divine fire comes into you, it illumines you, and you have the divine vision. So we have to be discerning about what place in the spiritual life we are. And again, I've already been trying to say here, we have to be honest about the fact that most of us are in the beginning of the spiritual life. We hardly are even in the, if you look at it, okay, ask yourself this question. I'm not going to ask anybody to say it out loud. Do you practice the virtues with labor and grief? Or are you completely happy all the time to obey the commandments? And you just completely have joy all the time at obeying the commandments. There's never any labor or grief in the virtues or the commandments. Okay, if you have labor and grief in the virtues, then that means you're a beginner. That's what this is saying. And so if that grief and sorrow at practicing the virtues is beginning to dissipate to a large extent, then maybe you can call yourself someone who's in the middle way. But to come to a state that one might call some sort of perfection, some sort of advanced state, then you need to be in a place where it's all love, it's all zeal, it's all divine fire. Practicing the virtues is not painful at all. So we've got to be honest about where we're at if we are going to read this book properly. Any questions or comments about that before I move on to how to read spiritual books? And I want to try to use this ladder as an example as to how we can read spiritual books and how we can be discerning. That's the whole problem here. The problem is this. In order to read spiritual books well, in order to apply them to our lives rightly, we need discernment. But discernment is the pinnacle of the active life. Discernment is the end goal of the active life. And we're not there. So the very thing we need in order to read the spiritual books properly is the very thing we don't have. The whole reason why we would want to engage in spiritual labels, for example, reading spiritual books. So we're in this catch-22. How do we get the discernment? How do we read the spiritual books properly? How do we apply them to our lives in a way that's good rather than harmful? Can anybody think of an instance or just maybe if there's a story someone wants to share, or maybe you don't want to share it because it's a little bit embarrassing, which is understandable. But maybe if you can think inside yourself, is there a time where you misapplied something that you read in Scripture or in another book and it ended up being harmful? Anybody have anything they'd like to share? I think I can tell this story. There was one person one time I was in conversation with, and there was a particular spiritual book that I recommended that he read, and it was not a good choice for him. It was too advanced for him, and he just didn't know how to apply it properly to his life, and went off with great zeal. You know, you got to give the guy some credit for his zeal and his sincerity. But it was a zeal that was leading him probably in the wrong direction, I think it's fair to say, because he didn't know the right way to read the book. He didn't know the right way to apply what he was reading to his life. And so he went off, and it's almost like this idea of a flame that burst up quickly, right? You got a certain amount of fuel, and you burst up with intensity, right? Well, if you burst up a flame with intensity and you only have so much fuel, what happens pretty quickly? The flame is totally gone. And we kind of, at that point, experience a fall. And then when we experience the fall, we fall into despair. And it ends up that it would have been better for us to have not even read that spiritual book at all, because the end result of it was despair. And that fuel that we could have spent on something good, we've actually spent on something that the end result of it is harmful. Anybody else have any questions or comments or want to say something about that?
I mean, I see this all the time as a priest. You know, whether it's biting off too much, more than the person can chew, trying to keep the fast perfectly or pray for 2 hours a day, and it lasts a little while, and then there's a complete collapse of the piety. So it's much better, our tradition would teach is much better to do a little bit every day, and be faithful in a little bit, and then grow in that. And but that requires humility. See, that's the problem. I want to be Superman today, and be a great spiritual hero today, and that isn't our tradition. Everything in our tradition speaks against that, including the Gospels. You know, if you want to be greatest in the kingdom, be the least. The Lord says.
Right. Right.
Speaking from experience as well, knowing that it can be tempting to sort of not do anything.
Yes.
It's like I'm not going to be able to do it anyway.
So why bother?
So why use the fuel?
And that's right. Zoe mentions that the other temptation is you read these spiritual books that are too advanced for you, and you say, well, I can't do that. And so you don't do anything at all. So that's the other direction that can be equally harmful, because you could have used that fuel for something and made some sort of progress if you'd known the right direction to apply it. That's the whole problem. You have to know the right direction to apply it, which is discernment, the pinnacle of the spiritual life. And again, this is why St. John says that the beginning of discernment is what? A true knowledge of oneself.
That's why you need a spiritual father.
And that's why you need a spiritual father. That's a point that St. John makes repeatedly throughout the book. You have to have a spiritual father. In a way, you could say the entire point he's making in the chapter in obedience is you got to have a spiritual father, right? That's the specific way that it applies to monks in a Cenobitic monastery. It's a little bit more complicated for people in the world, but you do have to have somebody who's more advanced than you and let them kind of give you encouragement or counsel.
I would say, though, I wouldn't even say that one has to confess that the person you're going to is more advanced, but there's something about another person being involved in your life, even if that person isn't particularly super, because the fathers teach that you can have a really bad abbot and be saved, and they also you can have a really bad priest and be saved, just by virtue of that accountability and by virtue of humility. And it's also important to say too that a spiritual father in the world functions very differently from a spiritual father in the monastery. In the monastery, there's a vow of obedience to the person who is a spiritual father. The whole rite of the monastic tonsure is very profound. That does not exist between the parish priest and the lay person. There is not that hardcore obedience. The obedience that I would direct you to would be the commandments of God. Obey His commandments. But if you say, Father, what job should I take? I'm not going to tell you, go pick the one. I'm not going to do that. You might be able to press me and get my honest opinion, but I'm going to just tell you my opinion and not say, well, you have to do that now. I'll tell you what I think, maybe. But whereas in the monastery, there's grace. I'll just show you this. The scary thing in the monastic tonsure is after the monk is made, the scissors are cut his hair, and then the abbot throws the scissors across the room and says, pick up the scissors and give them to me. And the monk toddles over and gets the scissors and brings them back. And 3 times the abbot throws them. And the point is that he might tell you to dig a ditch, he might tell you to climb a mountain, he might tell you to pray all night long. And you need to try to do that. But that is not at all that's a voluntary choice you make in a monastery. That is not the norm at all in the parish. It's very, very different. And I can't emphasize that enough as we hear this. It's very important.
The latter talks about that as well. There's this process where you and your spiritual father discern, the potential spiritual father discern together. Is this a match? And there's even a passage where it talks about how when your heart becomes favorably inclined to your spiritual father, God will work in your spiritual father's heart to make him favorably inclined to you. And there's this linking up that happens. My spiritual father is Father Alexander, monastic from Holy Cross Monastery, West Virginia. If I try to tell you the story of how he became my spiritual father, be honest with you, it's like I can't remember. It's like a blank spot. It's really weird, and it's just like it just happened. He's my spiritual father. I don't even know exactly how it came to be.
Do lay people have a relationship of obedience to the spiritual father? Or
It depends. It depends on your particular relationship. In most cases, vast majority of cases, there's not going to be any sort of obedience that is like what we're describing for a monastic with his spiritual father. There are exceptions to that. There are exceptions to that, but it's always going to be
it's voluntary, though.
Yeah.
If it's more than that, it's always voluntary. It can never be forced on the person. It's very important. We need that. Yeah.
So this definitely is a very difficult question of what does obedience look like in the life of someone who isn't a monastic. And it's one of the questions that I want to continue to address as we go along here. It's a complicated question. I don't profess to have all the answers myself. I think it's a question we have to get a handle on if we're going to apply a work like the Ladder of Divine Ascent to our lives, because this is written to people who have that sort of strict obedience to a spiritual father within a Cenobitic monastery. And so that's part of the problem of the way people will read this, and then they'll try to apply they'll read the ladder and they'll try to apply every single bit of things that they read. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because we don't have that relationship with an abbot, with a spiritual father. We have a different relationship, and so we have to apply it in a different way. I think we come.
It's worse when people read that and try to make the priest happy. That's not helpful.
Well, that's the whole point of the story I was telling earlier, right? So that these books are read without discernment, without an understanding of the audience of the book, that it was written to Cenobitic monks who have a certain relationship of obedience. And so that's why someone who reads them, who's just a beginner in the spiritual life completely, maybe doesn't even have any idea what monasticism is at all. If you don't have any idea what monasticism is at all, no clue about monasticism, you never met a monk in your life, I don't understand how you could even possibly begin to understand this book. It just is going to be just, and you're going to read it all in this abstract and try to make it apply to your life in a way that just is strange and warped. And therefore, it would be better for you to not read the book at all.
I realize that when the word is 3 or 4 times a day. We're not doing that.
Yeah. So we've got to be discerning about it. I think we've come to the end of our time. So what I'm going to do is next week we'll pick this up, and we'll pick up with how to read spiritual books. I want to look at a passage from the Arena by St. Ignatius Branchaninov, and he is dealing with this exact topic. If you want to read a book that is trying to grapple with this question that we're talking about right now, this is the book to read. The problem is that St. Ignatius says, we've declined to a lower spiritual state. We've declined to a lower spiritual state. I'm afraid that we've declined to even a lower spiritual state than the one that St. Ignatius was addressing. And so you have to kind of ratchet it down even more from what he says. But you can kind of get a sense as the process of what you have to go through in order to grapple with these questions. And I want to specifically look at the chapters where he talks about how to read spiritual books, how to apply them to our lives, and make that sort of a case study on this question. If you want to see what he says about other issues, and tries to flesh that out with other issues besides reading spiritual books, this book is highly recommended. So, and next week I have a list of books that are recommended as beginners books, and we'll talk through those, and hopefully that will be of assistance to you.